Hello. Today we are going to cover the final years of the Civil War. So we already talked about the early years, then we discussed the major turning points, and now we're going to talk about how basically the Civil War ends. Okay, and that we're really going to start around the December of 1862 area where we left off with the early years, but really more focusing on getting into the mid part of 1863 where things start to really turn in favor of the Union Army in the United States of America. So we already discussed the Emancipation Proclamation and the Battle of Gettysburg as major turning points in the war. And I just want to highlight a couple of the major takeaways from that. The Emancipation Proclamation, even though in practice it didn't technically free anyone because the Confederate States of America, considering themselves a separate nation, did not liberate their slaves, obviously, because they would not have seen Abraham Lincoln as having any authority to do that because he was not their president. But the reason why the Emancipation Proclamation is important is because it changed the purpose of the war from being just about reunification to about a higher purpose of abolishing slavery. It also opens the door for recruitment of Black soldiers, and that is going to be extremely important since there's such a high population of African Americans in the North. And it also makes clear to the South that if they should lose, they will not be able to come back into the Union with the practice of slavery. And so that makes it a major turning point. And then the Battle of Gettysburg, as we already talked about, which takes place in the very beginning of July of 1863, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of July, is a point at which you can say that the Confederate Army was never able to recover. They never have a decisive victory like they experienced in the early years of the war. After this point, they lose quite a bit of men. In fact, most people agree that if General Meade had followed Lee's army after his retreat from Gettysburg and attacked right afterwards, that probably would have decimated the Confederate Army and possibly ended the war a couple years earlier than it actually did end in 1865. But either way, this is a major loss for the Confederates, and they do never recover from it. So now we're going to move on and talk about Vicksburg, which actually takes place right around the same time as the Battle of Gettysburg, right after, essentially. And this is also a major victory for the Union and also a turning point. Vicksburg is basically the last holdout on the Mississippi River. So New Orleans has already fell. Vicksburg is actually north of New Orleans. But New Orleans has already has already fallen, and basically there has been a huge siege on Vicksburg to try to get control of it by the Union Army. And it does eventually fall to Union troops led by Grant, basically because he was able to blockade, not allowing supplies in or out, for 47 days. And this also resulted in 19,000 deaths on both sides, some of which were from starvation. But then Port Hudson in Louisiana falls, and this is the end for the Confederates along the Mississippi River. Effectively, it cuts off Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas from the rest of the Confederate States of America on the eastern side of the Mississippi River. And this is a huge achievement for the North because it's one of their strategic goals at the beginning of the war to take control of the Mississippi River. Okay, and you can see Vicksburg right there at the convergence of the arrows in the western part of the screen, or the left side of the screen. You can see where Vicksburg is in relationship to New Orleans. It's at the top part of Louisiana, Mississippi there. In March of 1864, due to Grant's effectiveness in the Western Theater, Lincoln makes him commander of the entire Union Army. and basically tasks him with putting an end to this war however he sees fit. So basically he gives Grant, rein. What is your plan for ending this war? And then put it into effect. So Grant's plan to put an end to the war is to attack and capture Richmond, which again is one of the first goals of the Union Army, to have General Tecumseh Sherman attack in the Deep South at the same time, and to basically bring the war to the doorstep of the people in the South in a devastating way. He introduces this concept of total war, which is destruction of the entire land, including, civilian land, farms, etc., and really bringing home the reality of war maybe to people who had been untouched by it. And this is definitely brutal, but it's very effective. So he begins the Wilderness Campaign in May of 1864, and this is basically a campaign to get from D.C. to Richmond and to get Richmond to fall. The reason why it's referred to as the Wilderness is because there's a lot of dense forest between Washington, D.C. and Richmond that they had to fight in, which made conditions very, very difficult. And this entire campaign is the 6 bloodiest weeks of the war. Again, because the casualties were so high, because Grant was willing to do what it took to win, even if that meant losing a lot of men. And that's not to say he was callous about it. There are many accounts of him, crying in his tent at the end of some of these battles because he was so devastated by the amount of men that he had lost. But the Union had 100,000 troops. The Confederacy only had about 60,000. Again, they were never able to recover from that Battle of Gettysburg, so they're mainly just playing defense survival by this time. There are huge casualties in the first Battle of the Wilderness, about 17,000 Union in one day, for example. And also brush fires and things like that burned many people left dying on the battlefield, burned them alive. But Grant, after this first victory in the Wilderness Campaign, is able to move south closer to Richmond. Okay, and this is the campaign. You can see how slowly Grant is moving his troops south to get closer to Richmond. Petersburg in June of 1864, which is actually south of Richmond, Grant took his army down around that way, was a vital connection point for the Confederacy, and Grant knew that if he could take it, Richmond would be cut off from their last supplies. And so the siege begins there and lasts for 9 months before Petersburg eventually falls, therefore opening up the door to Richmond. It's important at this point, too, to discuss the election of 1864. Now, back when we talked about the early years of the war, we discussed how, because the war was going so poorly for the United States in the early years, there was a lot of doubt as to whether or not Abraham Lincoln would even be nominated to run by the Republicans again, and let alone whether or not, if he were nominated, whether or not he could win. But because the tide of the war turns at a pretty important point, Lincoln is able to win re-election in 1864, and by a pretty wide margin. And he sees this victory, winning 55% of the popular vote and 212 electoral votes. He sees this as kind of a mandate. The people want me to be president. They trust me. And so I'm going to put an end to this war and enact some policies that I think are important. And one of those things was to push for the passage of the 13th Amendment, which added an amendment to the Constitution that abolished slavery. So whereas the Emancipation Proclamation could have been overturned after the war, an amendment to the Constitution is a lot more difficult to expunge. So Lincoln knew that if the South lost, which was pretty imminent at this stage, it's obvious that the South is going to lose. He knew that if they lost, he wanted to have an amendment in place before they surrendered that would abolish slavery. So there was no possibility that they could try to retain slavery and become part of the United States again. These are just some of the words from his second inaugural address, which I think sets the tone for how he had planned on dealing with the South once they surrendered. And this inaugural address is as much for his own people in the United States as it is for the people in the rebellious states of the South. He makes clear that he wants to welcome them back. He doesn't necessarily want to be extremely punitive, even though a lot of people in his party do want to be punitive. And this is important to understand too, and we'll talk more about this later, because it's fairly obvious that Lincoln would have handled Reconstruction, which is the period after the South is going to basically reintegrate itself into the United States. He would have handled that a lot differently if he had not been assassinated. Sherman's march to the sea refers to basically Sherman's movements from Atlanta in Georgia, marching to the coast and then moving up north to join Grant in Richmond. And basically it was a path of destruction. He became known as a butcher, sort of like Grant did, because not just military engagements happened, but he burned villages and farms as he went along. And a lot of people saw this as completely out of bounds for warfare at this time. But there is no doubt that it was certainly effective. It really lowered the morale of people in the South, and it helped lessen their desire to keep fighting. And also, many slaves in the South left the plantations, escaped to basically be under the protection of Sherman and his army and the Northern Army, and they marched with him and even helped the effort. So that was pretty key for the North as well. And you can see the arrows show where he left Atlanta and then marched to the south marched southeast to Savannah, and then north up to eventually join Grant in Virginia. Finally, in April of 1865, Lee withdraws from Petersburg. That's the last area basically that is able to supply Richmond, and Richmond falls relatively quickly after this. The entire Confederate government flees, including the President of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis himself, and the formal end to the war comes shortly after that, when Lee surrenders his entire army at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th of 1865. Basically, this is the end. Even though there are some militant Southerners who are talking about fleeing to Cuba and trying to carry on the war from there, Jefferson Davis, after he flees, he gets his cabinet back together and then dissolves the Confederate government, basically giving up himself. So he's saying, nope, we've lost. This is the end. And that, in addition to the surrender of the entire army at Appomattox Courthouse, is the end of the Civil War. What happens at the surrender is important because it reflects how Lincoln would have treated Reconstruction. Lee and Grant meet, and Grant allows the officers to keep their horses. Soldiers were able to keep their small firearms, and Grant gives Lee rations to feed his troops so that they can go back home. And again, this shows the reconciliatory nature of how Lincoln wanted to treat the South. He didn't want to be, lorded over them that they had lost and be punitive, but he wanted to be accepting of them. Okay, and this shows Appomattox Courthouse in Richmond and some of those other conflicts. Of course, 5 days after the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, and that is devastating, as we'll talk about, and as you'll learn more about in high school, because it really changed how Reconstruction was handled, and that is going to lead to some pretty severe consequences down the line that we're still dealing with